The Marathon des Sables takes place in Morocco every year and consists of 6 stages covering around 250 kilometers through the Sahara, which participants complete carrying all necessary supplies, food, gear, a first aid kit, because the organization provides only water at checkpoints and basic shelter for the night, and everything else is the runner's own responsibility. Daytime temperatures reach 50 degrees, nights are cold, and the terrain shifts from sand dunes to rocky plateaus, which requires each participant to manage heat load, water consumption, physical condition, and pace all at the same time. In 1994, Mauro Prosperi took part in this race, an Italian police officer who competed professionally in modern pentathlon, a sport that demands swimming, fencing, equestrian riding, shooting, and running simultaneously. And for that reason, people who train in it seriously grow accustomed to prolonged physical strain and discomfort, because without that, it is impossible to train or compete in pentathlon at any serious level. Which is why, during the first 3 days of the race, Mauro moved at his normal pace, managed his water intake and physical load, and nothing in those first 3 days went beyond what he had expected. On the 4th day, the wind picked up sharply, and within a few hours turned into a full sandstorm that reduced visibility to a few meters and blocked out every landmark. The storm lasted around 8 hours, and throughout that time he kept moving, following his compass, although a compass only records the direction of movement and cannot tell you whether that direction matches the route you need, especially when there is not a single fixed point around you to check your position against. When the storm ended and visibility returned, there were no other runners, no route markers, no signs that an organized race had ever passed nearby, and that alone was a clear signal, because the Des Sables course is marked densely enough that if the markers are not visible, you are already off the route. He set a bearing on his compass that he calculated would lead him to the next checkpoint and moved forward, because there were no other options. The main problem was that over 8 hours of the storm, he had covered some distance in an unknown direction and now had no way of knowing where he was relative to the course or how far from it, which meant that all his subsequent compass calculations were built on a starting point he could not determine. He walked in the direction he believed was correct, but he had no way to verify this because there was not a single landmark that could confirm it. By the evening of the first day after the storm, the checkpoint that should have appeared along the route had not appeared, and everything around looked the same. Sand, rocks, scattered stone outcroppings, no signs of people. He kept moving, checking his compass, but a compass only shows direction, and he had no way of knowing whether he was getting closer to the course or moving away from it, because there was nothing to check that against. He still had some water, not much, because race supplies are calculated on the assumption that a runner reaches water at checkpoints at set intervals, and the amount each runner carries is designed for completing one stage, not for several days without any resupply points. He began strictly rationing his intake, taking small sips at a time, although in heat during active movement, dehydration builds faster than a person starts to feel it, and by the time clear symptoms appear, it is already affecting the speed of thinking. At night, the temperature dropped, and several hours passed in a half-sleep, after which neither strength nor warmth had returned, because spending a night in the cold without shelter after a full day in the heat does not allow normal sleep. The following morning he moved forward again, because staying still gave him no chance of reaching the course, and the water was running out either way. On the second day, another factor entered the situation. By that point, the organizers should have already logged his absence at the checkpoint and launched a search, which meant that somewhere nearby there should have been people or helicopters. There were none, and this meant either that he was moving in the direction opposite to the search zone, or that he had gone far enough from the route that the standard search zone did not cover him, and the second option meant complete isolation with no set end point. The water ran out in the middle of the second day, and after that, every decision keep moving, stop, find shade had to be made, knowing there would be no resupply. He started moving only in the early morning and late evening, stopping during the hottest hours in whatever shade he could find to reduce fluid loss, and he tried to locate any source of moisture, But this part of the desert offered nothing, and after 2 days without water, it became clear that continuing forward by the same approach would not bring him back to the course. On the 3rd day, he came across a small stone structure, a marabout, an abandoned Islamic shrine of the kind found in various parts of the Sahara. Inside, it was dark and cool, and he decided to stay there, because in an enclosed space in the shade, the heat load on the body decreases and fluid loss slows, which meant the time before complete exhaustion was extended. He stopped moving during the daytime hours, because continuing to walk without water under direct sun meant losing his remaining strength within a few hours. This decision bought him time, although it did not change the situation itself, and he understood that. Bats lived inside the marabout, and this gave him both food and moisture at the same time. He caught several, ate them raw, and drank their blood, because in that condition, it was the only available source of protein and fluid. He also drank his own urine, which at severe dehydration gives the body a few additional hours of function, after which the effect stops. At some point, he concluded that he would not make it out of the desert alive, and attempted to open the veins on his wrists with a shard of glass he found inside the structure. There was almost no bleeding, because at severe dehydration the blood thickens and clots quickly, and the wound closed on its own before anything could happen. After that, he continued doing the same things, catching bats, drinking urine, lying in the shade and waiting. According to him, after the failed attempt, something shifted in how he related to what was happening, and he kept going through the same actions without any calculation about a specific outcome, simply because there was nothing else to do. After several days in the marabout, it became clear that staying there any longer was not a solution either, because the bats were running out, his own resources were running out, and every day of stillness meant further weakening of a body that would be even less capable of moving when he finally left. He had spent several days in the shelter. The exact number varies slightly across his accounts, and at some point, the calculation shifted. It was better to die moving than to wait for the point where moving became physically impossible. Left the marabout in the early morning while the sun had not yet reached full strength, and moved in the direction that seemed most justified, using the terrain as a guide and trying to stay in low-lying areas, because in the desert water, where it exists at all, flows downward, and dry riverbeds wadis sometimes retain moisture below the surface, where none is visible from above. This was not an instinctive choice, but a specific navigation principle, and the fact that he was still applying it shows that his thinking at that point was still functioning in a structured way. By that time, his physical condition was already very poor. He had lost significant weight, his skin had cracked, small wounds were not healing, and each step was harder than the one before. The heat, which at the start of the race had been a manageable condition, now pressed down constantly without pause, and his body had nothing left to respond with, because normal sweating requires water that was not there, which meant heat was accumulating faster than his body could deal with it. And this created a growing deficit that movement alone could not stop. At some point he found a wadi, a dry riverbed that carries water at other times of year, and followed it, because a wadi sets a direction and is the only stable landmark in this part of the desert that does not disappear or shift after wind. From a survival logic standpoint, this was the right decision, because wadis eventually lead toward lower parts of the terrain, meaning toward places where human presence is at least possible, although the nearest nomadic camps in this part of the Sahara can be several days of walking away. By the end of the day, he was thinking only about continuing to move, because each stop was harder than the last, and getting back up after it required a separate act of will. According to him, during this period he stopped measuring distances and stopped counting hours, because doing so only intensified the sense of how little ground he was covering, and he simply took the next step, because that was the only action he was still able to perform. He was found by a young Berber girl who was herding livestock near her family's camp. She spotted a figure moving along the wadi and brought him back to her family, who gave him water and food. After that, he was handed over to the Algerian military authorities, who had already been searching for the missing race participant, but had been doing so in a different location. It turned out that by that point, he was not in Morocco, where the race had taken place, but in Algeria. Over the days of wandering, he had covered around 300 kilometers from the point where he had lost the route, crossed a national border, and ended up in territory that the search zone did not cover. That is exactly why the search teams had not found him. They were working in the right area for a standard situation, but his situation was not standard. The race organizers had by that point already informed his wife that he had most likely died, and the official end of the search was a matter of the next few days. When he appeared alive, it came as a surprise to everyone involved in the search operation, because by that point around 9 days had passed since the storm. The physical consequences were serious. He had lost around 18 kilograms in 9 days. His kidneys and other internal organs had taken on a load that required medical monitoring. The wounds on his wrists needed treatment, and recovery took several months. The skin did not heal quickly, and the effects of infections that had developed without any hygiene continued to make themselves known long after he returned. Several years later, he came back to the Marathon des Sables and completed it several more times, describing it without particular explanation as the next start in a race he already knew. If you remove everything secondary from this story, what remains is the following. A man ended up in a situation that most people do not survive, and he made it out because every day he made at least one concrete decision: where to stop, which direction to move, what to eat. And the sum of those decisions eventually brought him to a place where he could be found,